What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Space Marine 2. A third-person shooter, focusing, of course, on the Space Marines from the Warhammer universe as they fight against Tyranids and the forces of chaos. But before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements and also includes a lot more, though in this case the achievement list is fairly thorough, outside of, I would say, the PvP mode, which we'll get to. But if you want to learn more, there's a video down in the description below, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. With that in mind, when it comes to Space Marine 2, I did in fact pay for this. Specifically, I bought the access that came with Early Access, which is how I'm bringing you this review. I've already put about 60 hours in it since that initial Early Access period, which is honestly, on its own, probably a little remarkable because this is not my usual type of game. I just had so much fun after trying it out that despite this being a pretty heavily co-op and multiplayer title, that I knew I simply wanted to play more and all of it. And with that in mind, I'm going to try to cover this as thoroughly as possible, but again, it's a little outside of my normal range, so that's something to know. With that out of the way, though, let's dive into this one. Space Marine 2 is, as I mentioned, a third-person shooter, specifically a follow-up, of course, to Space Marine, which was itself a fairly popular title for the Warhammer universe. The single-player campaign picks back up as Titus, who begins the title by becoming a Primaris Marine, a sort of souped-up version of regular Space Marines, only to be immediately called upon to take the battle to the Tyranids specifically, and then later on some forces of chaos that naturally predominate the setting as well. Now, in service to that, though, the game does encompass a few different modes. So we've got the single-player campaign primarily, though you can play this with a friend if you want. You've got the Operations, which is co-op PvE for the most part, but can also be done solo. And then the multiplayer PvP. So there's a fair bit to go over, though first let's start with the technical state of things. How is this game running? So right away, I think a game like this looks incredible. I think it is really, really cool to see these gigantic sci-fi battles playing out in the background as you fight your way through hordes of enemies, like literally swarms of them. And I think it's especially impressive how many actors, so to speak, that they got on screen all at once, which is something that even the Steam Deck manages to do very well. Surprisingly so. I thought it was going to run much worse there than it did. But that's not to say it's all sunshine and rainbows. Now, most of the problems I ran into personally seem to be on the server side of things when I was playing things other than the main campaign. That is to say, some sort of crash related to lost connection. I got booted from a couple of matches. Servers seemed to be down at one point. The matchmaking itself, I think, could use some tweaks and work, as you have very little control over that, or even, say, applying for custom game modes. A lot of the matchmaking, even for Operations, which can be done solo, is automatic, and there's no way to, just turn it off, outside of disconnecting from the internet, which is its own headache. And then I ran into a variety of just small visual stuff, like some armor and assets kind of freaking out here and there in cutscenes and looking a little silly. So there's definitely that. Now, I have seen reports of other people suffering more serious issues, but they don't seem to be especially widespread, but there certainly seems to be potential for issues. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's move on a little bit to the difficulty side of things. So, this is broken up into mostly Operations and the single-player campaign. So the main campaign, if you will, is a little more set in its difficulty because there is not so much progression for the single-player version. You mostly just get access to different weapons as you go. So ramping up the difficulty on that campaign means having to engage with the mechanics and weapons just dealing the damage that they deal, etc. But you can choose between one of 4 difficulties and kind of tailor that experience to what you personally are comfortable with, which is especially important if you're playing solo, because one thing you'll notice pretty quickly is that the bots, while not completely useless, definitely could stand to be a little better, and they are a little prone to just standing around, or worse, just seemingly attacking random stuff with little to no benefit to you. Now, strangely enough, I actually found the bots to work better in the Operations mode of the game, which is where I thought they would do worse just because of the open-ended nature of that, but it seems like they have some sort of health protection in that mode that makes them less likely to die on you, and so while not nearly as good as an actual person, they are better in that mode. Now, speaking of Operations, this version also has 4 different difficulty modes, minimal to ruthless. This ups the strength and health of the enemies you're going to be facing. And seeing how you're going to be facing so many of them at once, it's pretty easy to die if you go too big too fast. Now, unlike the campaign, this is mostly tied to progression, specifically the damage your weapon is dealing by your ability to upgrade it as you go. So while Ruthless starts out basically impossible right at the beginning, as you gain upgrades and everything, it becomes easier and easier. And then at max level for the operations side, especially with a team of other people who are also leveled, you should be more than okay. Whereas the PvP mode is more skill-based, of course. Now from there, let's talk a little bit about the single-player campaign, basically the setup for it and my thoughts on it. Now do be advised of a few spoilers here and there. It's a relatively short campaign, so talking about it much at all is realistically a spoiler to some degree, but this is really the only part of the video that will touch on that because it's a sort of standalone mode unto itself. Now in the campaign mode, we play as Lieutenant Titus, as he is welcomed back to the Ultramarines after some exceptional service in the Death Watch, which he was in after being under suspicion of corruption by the forces of chaos. But having proven that was never the case, he was not only rescued from a life-endangering situation, he was restored as a Primaris Marine, an upgrade in power, essentially, for those who don't want to get deep into Warhammer 40k lore. But as I mentioned earlier, we are immediately thrown into a fight against the Tyranids, which is what we were doing on the planet as Deathwatch anyway, as our job was to set off a virus bomb to temporarily weaken them. And then the rest of the campaign is all about trying to stop the Tyranids and fight against them as much as possible before the forces of chaos get involved, and you do a little bit of fighting against them as well. So the story is mission-based, as you might expect. You operate out of a hub, which is true for all of the modes, and you can replay these missions as you please, so it's a relatively shorter linear experience, as tends to be the case with these types of games. I would say it'll probably run you somewhere between 7 to 10 hours, depending on how much of the sites you decide to take in. But during that time, I think it does a fantastic job of representing Warhammer 40k. And one thing especially that I really liked is how much it showcases people who are not Space Marines, the everyday soldier who do the bulk of defending against these threats, with the Space Marines being more of a special operations unit at this point. So seeing their interactions both with the everyday defenders and how well that was done while also capturing a bit of what their life was like, I thought was a really great touch. And that's to say nothing of some pretty fantastic writing in places, some really great moments. And while I have some minor gripes, some mission moments that were especially annoying due to combat AI, them going a little crazy on using the word brother constantly, but that's pretty in character if anything. But overall, I had a really great time with it. I thought the last couple missions especially were really cool, and it was mostly over-the-top, non-stop action, which is what I want from a game like this personally. But I would say that realistically, the story's primary purpose is to get you familiar with the game's mechanics alongside the weapons and stuff before you go and tackle the rest of the game. That is to say, operations and PvP. So we're going to switch to talking about progression a little bit here, and it's different for each one of those three modes. Now, the campaign is pretty simple. As you advance in missions, you basically just get access to other weapons and whatnot, and that's really all there is. You're playing as Titus. He has a sort of set strength, if you want to put it that way. So the progression for the campaign is mostly just you learning how the game works before moving on to the other modes. Now, the real progression is in operations and PvP. We'll do PvP first because it's also pretty simple. Basically, the more you participate in that mode, you'll earn points toward veterancy levels, which allows you to unlock extra weapons and loadouts that you can take into a match right away, as one of the 6 available classes available both in PvP and operations. So basically, the more you play it, the more you can tailor what you're doing to how you like to play, which for me was absolutely the Assault class. But as we switch over to Operations, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, Operations is your co-op PvE if that's how you want to play the game. You don't have to do this in co-op. You can, in fact, play this solo, but the game does try to auto-matchmake you, which means it can be a little annoying to get the game to let you do these solo. But if you quit out of a squad enough, it seems to just finally stop trying to matchmake you, and I would honestly just prefer an option to turn the matchmaking off, since it's intended to be allowed that you tackle those things solo if you want. So it's ridiculous I can't just click a button to do that. But otherwise, I enjoyed Operations. So what are they? Now, narratively speaking, these are side missions that take place alongside the main campaign as you're going through that. There are support groups that will be aiding your main character's mission in that mode, and Operations allows you to actually play through those individual missions and tasks. Now, unfortunately, there are only 6 of these, and a little more variety would have been nice, but otherwise I enjoyed them a lot. They have those 4 different difficulties, as I mentioned, but then as you play through those missions, you start engaging with the game's biggest progression systems. So right away, as you successfully complete Operations, you'll earn more and more cosmetic options that are available even in the PvP mode for your Space Marine, so you can look cool while you kill everything, but you're also going to be earning experience and armory data. So experience both levels you and your weapons up. Now you have a character level up to a maximum of 25, and as you level up, you unlock perks that you can then buy with the currency that you get for just winning versions of Operations. So if you successfully complete a mission, you get this little currency to spend in the armory hall at your hub, and then you can buy your perks with that, which are all pretty cheap, and then also unlock further cosmetics and decals with it. But your weapons are as much of a focus as these perks. So as you take on higher difficulties of Operations, you can earn a rarity associated armory data. Your sort of normal, epic, and legendary versions of these that allow you to upgrade your weapon as you hit certain experience caps. Unlocking the next tier for your weapons both upgrades them visually, while also allowing you to equip versions of those weapons that deal more damage. Each of those versions of a weapon can further be mastered as you earn experience, which then unlocks perk points for that weapon specifically, which makes it even deadlier. And the damage and the perks from that is, I would say, the biggest part of Operations progression, as that's what's really going to allow you to push those higher difficulties. Now, something that took me way too long to notice is that while you don't need a ton of armory data to unlock these, you can actually instantly master the different versions of the weapons for its perk point if you have extra armory data for that tier, which can be handy if there's a version of a weapon you don't want to use, because say take the melee weapons for instance. There's a few of them, but some of these versions come with different methods of blocking. Now, some of them will literally say blocking, and that's actually the worst one because those ones don't allow you to parry the enemy, and parrying, especially more melee-oriented special enemies, is like the best way to deal with them, so you might want to watch out for that. But that's the bulk of what to know progression-wise, so let's move on to the gameplay, the world, and the combat, as that's kind of all one and the same here. But primarily, first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about how this game is structured and some important things to know. As I mentioned, we operate out of a hub area. This includes the launch bay and the armory hall primarily. The armory hall is what is going to allow you to customize your marine, your loadouts, that you can have up to 3 saved for. You can access the other 2 outside of the one you're using in Operations missions sometimes at certain little checkpoints, which is handy in case you want to switch weapons like mid-mission. And the launch bay and the terminal there is how you'll determine the game mode that you're in and what you want to do next. Now that's important because while the campaign is pretty well curated in terms of the experiences and encounters you'll have, the operations operate a little bit differently as you might expect. They're slightly more roguelite in nature where your overall goals stay the same every time you do them, but what you might encounter will and can change. Sometimes you'll be attacked by big terminus level enemies which take a significant amount of firepower to bring down, effectively acting as boss fights. You can also get attacked by enemy waves as you go, and even some of the actual objectives that you are pursuing will change slightly based on what you've got going on, which again I think would have been better served over a bigger variety of missions, but otherwise was pretty fun. Now while you are on any of those mission levels, basically most of what you're going to be doing is fighting and pushing forward. There's not too much to do in the levels besides take in the scenery and occasionally find items that'll be laying around, such as ammo or med packs, that type of thing. Standard stuff really. And occasionally you'll find a data slate which can give you like a little bit of lore, but that is about it. So the missions themselves, outside of fighting the enemies, are definitely a little sparse. But probably the coolest thing about this is definitely whatever technology is running these swarms of enemies that will come at you. And at least to my mind, it's wild how many of these they manage to get on screen all at once without, at least in my experience, having much problem at all. And again, even the Steam Deck seemed to perfectly manage this. Now, initially, I thought some of these swarms might have just been like a visual trick because they often come up to like ledges and whatnot, and then they sort of climb on top of each other. So I thought maybe those swarms at the bottom were maybe just visual effects and weren't actually enemies, but they are in fact enemies. They will all eventually climb up to fight you. You can even throw grenades down and, prevent them from climbing up to begin with if you've got the firepower for it, and that was genuinely wild to me. But from there, I want to talk a little more about operations and PvP specifically. In particular, though, the classes for both of them and then the game modes and stuff for PvP. Before we start talking a little bit about how combat specifically works. So the classes. You've got Tactical, Assault, Vanguard, Bulwark, Sniper, and Heavy. Each of these has a different sort of ultimate ability. Personally, my favorite was Assault by far. Mostly because, while a lot of this game is shooting, the Assault class really leans into melee weaponry and jumping around and smash attacking everything, and both in PvE and PvP I had a ton of fun with that, but it did seem to have a bit more of a skill ceiling because, range-wise you don't have a lot of options. But each of them is pretty good. Tactical is a great all-arounder, has a buff that deals more damage to everyone inside an area. Vanguard was also really great. They've got like a grapple thing and they're fantastic in like quick melee actions. Bulwark is obviously more defensive. They've got one that will restore your armor points. Personally, my least favorite, but I could see why someone would enjoy it. Sniper is all about ranged attacks. Less useful against the large swarms of enemies, but fantastic for taking down the bigger enemies. And then finally, Heavy. Slow but devastating, as you might imagine. Their Iron Halo ability protects them from ranged frontal damage while they just focused on shooting, and combined with heavy weapons, which you can only temporarily carry in the main campaign that they just get all the time, is a ton of fun. I liked Heavy, but I liked Assault a lot more. And then as you progress these and get perks in Operations mode, they get even better and better, whereas in PvP you progress and unlock the exact loadout you like to play for that class. But there are some minor gripes that are associated with class specifically. Now in PvP I think this makes more sense, but you are limited in the amount of each class you can have on one team. Basically 2 per. And that's fine. Again, I think it makes sense there, though I do wish there were more open rules to be adjusted in PvP generally, because you only have access to 3 game modes, and I really just wanted to see more options there in general. But I think that just about knocks out that section before we can talk specifically about combat and how some of this works. Now this part might be a little dry, but there's some interesting stuff I want to talk about here. So combat, as you've almost certainly seen here, is us battling against hordes of enemies, but in order to do that there's some important stuff to know. Enemies are divided up into one of 4 levels: Minoris, Majoris, Extremis, or Terminus. Minoris and Majoris you're going to see everywhere. It's the bulk of what you're fighting. Minoris are the little swarm enemies. They're mostly easy to kill if you're on the difficulty you should be on, but their goal is to basically kill you with just sheer numbers. Now Majoris, on the other hand, are the characters that are able to do some real damage to you and have a lot more health, requiring more of your attention to take out, but you will still be fighting quite a few of them, which means it's necessary to learn their attack patterns. Now, thankfully, the enemy variety being down to Tyranids and some Chaos Marines, but also specific enemies performing specific actions makes that a little easier to learn. Now, where things start to get a little more tricky is with the Extremis and Terminus enemies. Now, Extremis are specialty monsters of some description, like a Lictor or a Ravener, that have special attacks and methods that you'll need to deal with. In fact, the Lictor goes invisible and likes to attack from ambushes, but a Tactical's special ability will reveal it. A Zoanthrope is a Tyranid that sort of flies up and shoots energy at you, which is incredibly annoying to deal with as an assault character who doesn't have a lot of ranged options, as an example. But all of these enemies typically have very specific attack patterns that can be then dealt with accordingly. In particular, this is where parrying comes in the most, though it's also a thing with Majoris enemies. Enemies will occasionally flash blue. That is a parryable attack, and if you time it right, you can do that. The window's pretty generous, but it does depend upon which weapon you have. Personally, I liked weapons with a balanced approach, as the timing for that parry seemed to be exactly in line with how I thought about parrying, but there's also ones that have like fencing, for instance, which is a little different speed-wise. Now, if you perfectly parry something or perfectly dodge out of the way of it, that enemy will be opened up to a gunshot, which is a very large damage single-shot attack that restores armor. More on armor momentarily. But both gunshots, which can also be done to smaller enemies by simply heavy attacking them if that doesn't kill them to begin with, and you're parrying those big attacks is realistically probably the easiest way to deal with a lot of these bigger enemies. And if you master that, you're going to do very well at combat, especially because those actions are often what is going to restore your armor. Now your armor varies a little bit by the class and difficulty, but typically you're going to have 3 points. Small enemies will chip away at this, whereas bigger enemies will deal several points all at once, potentially, and deal with it very quickly. So in order to get around that armor loss, you have to constantly be regenerating it through those perfect parries, perfect dodges, executions as well. When enemies get low on health, they start flashing red, and you can execute them in a single attack that both gives you armor and makes you immune to other attacks for a few seconds. And as you take damage to your actual health, you do have a moment where attacking enemies will get some of that lost health back, and executions in particular will restore all of it. So much of combat, in my experience with this game, comes down to managing just the sheer numbers of enemies you're dealing with while also maintaining your own armor, which against certain combinations of enemies is certainly more difficult than it might initially sound. But for the most part, I enjoyed that setup enough to have played this game as much as I did, despite it normally not really being in my wheelhouse, though I did gravitate towards melee specifically because of how much fun I had parrying everything. But ultimately, I will say how much you like that system is going to determine how much you like this game. And while I think it is easy enough to learn and decently challenging to master, especially against large enemies, I could see it not being everybody's cup of tea, but for the most part, I had a ton of fun with this. But before we wrap this section up a little bit, let's talk a tiny bit about those terminus enemies I mentioned. Basically, these are like large enemies with health bars. They have set attacks and everything, they deal massive amounts of damage, and they can pretty easily kill you. When you kill them in operations, they actually drop armory data, which is why you would want to stop and kill them, despite the fact that you can typically run by most of them. But these include things like a Carnifex, a Neurothrop, or a Hellbrute, all of which are appropriately big, terrifying enemies that going head-to-head with is a lot of fun. Though, as I mentioned, in operations, a lot of times like any combination of these things can spawn in a given area, but there are some general rules, it would seem. After like an enemy wave or an extremist enemy, you're often not going to see either of those things for at least a couple of minutes, and then while a terminus level enemy is on the field, those other things typically will not happen unless you're progressing past the point where the kind of like arena, for lack of a better word, for the previous enemy was. The terminus one, in this case. So once you kind of learn the ins and outs of those rules and what will attack you when, you can get really good at tackling each of these individually, which I think, again, for me, was a lot of the fun of this title. Now, last but not least for this particular section is talking a little bit about PvP combat, because that's obviously different. PvP is much faster than the other game modes. Matches typically don't last particularly long, and they tend to be very, I would say, glass cannon versus glass cannon type of matches. Both you and the enemy will typically die in just a few hits. So it's really more about like bursting enemies down before they can do the same to you than anything else. Now, when you get good at that and you expect it, it can be a ton of fun. And with the Assault class in particular, I was having a blast, especially because your jump attack in that mode actually functions a little differently than in PvE, where it takes longer to recharge. But you're vulnerable up in the air while you're charging that down, so the best way to use it realistically is to surprise enemies who do not see you. But even in that case, you don't have access to a lot of properly ranged weaponry as an Assault class who focuses on melee, so you're pretty easily taken down at range yourself. And every class kind of has something like that. But for the most part, I had a pretty good time with this, though I fully admit I was mostly just after the multiplayer achievements before dipping out on the PvP. So I fully admit I did not play this nearly as much as the other modes, and mostly just wanted to get a good idea of how it functioned. So there is that, but it's definitely the kind of thing where you want to pick a class and figure out how you want to play and get really good at it to do the best you can. That brings us to the Steam Deck version, however. So surprisingly, the Steam Deck, I think, runs at least the operations and main campaign side of this pretty well. You got controller support, cloud saves naturally, and the frame rate is even decent if you bring all of the settings down, which even on low looks pretty good on that smaller screen. Now the catch here is, I think, fairly obvious in that a lot of the fun of this game is the multiplayer modes for many people, and with the Steam Deck being more on the go, that might not necessarily work out. And I think that would be my primary consideration for playing this on Steam Deck for most people. Personally, I don't like playing stuff like this with a controller. I'm keyboard and mouse all the way. But I know that that's opposite of many. But for others, again, I think the Steam Deck part just comes down to, are you always using your Steam Deck where you have a proper internet connection? so you can play in those modes with other people, and if not, are you fine with playing just the solo side of things, which is possible. But with that out of the way, let's move on to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, definitely the moment-to-moment gameplay, fighting against what seems like innumerable enemies only to wind up coming out on top when you get the gameplay down, and the feel of that all around is fantastic. I think visually it's a very stunning game as well, and it really captures, I think, the fantasy of playing as one of these giant superhumans tearing through the enemies of the Imperium of Man. And that's by far the best thing this game has going for it. Now, on the negative side of things, that's where things get interesting, because I do actually think there are a variety of negatives to this game, but it really just depends on how much any one of those individually bothers you. For instance, I don't think the matchmaking of this game is particularly good. It's often matching you with people who are already playing the same class and operations, which it doesn't allow you to do. You have to go either change class, which might change the level of the people it matchmakes you with, making the mission that you signed up for impossible. You also can't simply turn the matchmaking off despite being able to play that solo, which seems silly, and just not having options to customize that experience a little more than is available, especially when it comes to like PvP, which seems super limited if fun, is definitely, I think, a bit of a bummer. It's also sad, I think, that the bot AI is kind of woefully underprepared for a large amount of situations you might find yourself in, and in operations you can get yourself to a point where that's not such a big deal, but even then, the max difficulty with bots is going to be really hard because those bots are difficult to direct properly. Whereas I think on the difficulty just below that, substantial, bots are perfectly fine if your character is kitted out for it. But the other negative for me, realistically, is just that I wish there was more variety to the missions and gameplay modes and stuff that were available, because as it stands right now, I think those are pretty limited, and in the course of this 100% review, it did absolutely get extremely tedious to run through the exact same missions over and over again, even if I was having a ton of fun with the combat itself. Now, personally, I don't see wanting more of a game as the worst thing a game could do. That is to say, if I walk away from a game going, man, I wish I could have played more of that, and that there was more content, etc., that's not necessarily the worst thing a game might have going for it. So, again, how much that bothers you is going to be up in the air, which brings me to my conclusion. Simply put, I played this game for 60 plus hours. I think it was like 61 or 62, something like that. Despite this normally not even being the kind of game that I like to play, but it felt so incredible to play. The story was really cool. The over-the-top feel of it all really drew me in. And again, I paid for this one out of pocket. Specifically the gold edition, which was like $90 US, and I feel perfectly good about that. I had a lot of fun for that price, and now that we're past the early access period, I think the standard version for $60 definitely justifies the price tag. However, there is a pricing thing I wanted to mention, specifically the gold edition and the ultra edition, the ones that come with the season pass and everything. That mostly appears to be cosmetic stuff, which you would only really bother to know if you actually navigated to the Steam page for the season pass specifically. Now, supposedly, these are also supposed to be coming with free updates to the game that add things like another difficulty, more missions, and new enemy types, but obviously those things aren't in there right now. So it looks to me that long term they probably plan on keeping these servers up via the sale of these cosmetic DLCs that allow you to customize your Space Marine in various ways, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing if the actual updates the game does get, those extra missions, lethal difficulty, the new modes, etc., over the course of, I believe, like 2025 they have planned right now, are in fact free and added at no charge to you, then I think that's not so bad. But I mention that specifically here at the end because that is the kind of situation that, let's be honest, we've seen turn south many, many times for many, many games. And while I don't think that's the case here now, I just want people to be aware of it. But as it stands, simply put, I paid for this game out of pocket, I had a ton of fun with it, and I'm honestly looking forward to when some of these free updates drop, because as I said, mostly I just want to play more of this game. So that, I think, is where I'm going to leave this particular review, so I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.